Because it's such a hot topic in fitness nowadays, let's go back to talking about muscle. Now, in general, when we talk about muscle, we're not referring to sport specificity or even strength. We're generally talking about muscular hypertrophy or the act of growing muscle. And while we're not bodybuilders, this is our primary concern if we're training for just health and overall fitness, as well as injury prevention and recovery. One of the key aspects of muscular hypertrophy is referred to as the Henneman size principle. We're going to talk about it today in this video because with an understanding of the size principle, you can kind of tweak different variables in your training to make the most out of certain circumstances and not just constantly have to try to add 5 pounds every week. And that's a good segue into the first portion of this discussion, which is that of progressive overload. Now, a lot of people think that progressive overload, as in always adding more weight to the bar, we'll say, is the key determinant for muscle growth. Other people argue that it's volume. I'm more of a volume advocate. However, both load and volume are aspects of what really drives muscular growth, which is mechanical tension. And so true progressive overload, which can include things like volume, is more aptly termed progressive tension overload. Now, the term progressive tension overload is key when we talk about the size principle. Now, what the size principle states is that motor units are recruited in an orderly fashion from smallest to biggest. There's a little bit more to that definition, but before we move on, let's talk about what a motor unit is. So a motor unit simply is a neuron and all the muscle that it innervates. In other words, that's the thing that carries the signal from your brain and transduces it through the muscle to tell the muscle to do work. Now let's go back to our size principle definition, how motor units are recruited in an orderly fashion from smallest to biggest. The more detailed definition is that motor units are recruited in an orderly fashion from smallest and least force producing to largest and most force producing. An important distinction to make as well between the larger and the smaller fibers is that the smaller fibers are much slower to fatigue, whereas the larger, more force producing fibers are much quicker to fatigue. Herein lies our distinction between what are referred to as type 1 and type 2 fibers, or colloquially slow and fast twitch, or as Henneman et al. Discovered in the 60s, the red, more oxygenated slow twitch fibers versus they termed pale, the white, less oxygenated fast twitch fibers. And you could clearly see the distinction in color types back with 1960s technology. Now in 2024, under a microscope, you can clearly see a distinction between the fast and slow twitch fibers just visually. What's neat is they actually discovered this by studying the muscles of cats, specifically feline calf muscles. The gastrocs, the bigger kind of upper meaty calf muscle, was more fast twitch. Well, it had a mix. It had fast and slow twitch, whereas the soleus was almost entirely slow twitch. And you see something similar in human calf muscles as well, but that's a tangent. Now, when we want to think about what's going to make sense for our training in the gym, we have to think about why would we have evolved this adaptation in the first place? What would be the advantage to having our body structured in this manner? If you think about it, delicate, fine motor control things like writing, painting, holding your children, moving your eyelids, you really don't want to do those things with really powerful but quickly fatiguing muscles, right? You want to be able to do that stuff, kind of a lot spread out over a meaningful period of time. And so that's why those structures are predominantly slow twitch, slow fatiguing, low force producing, highly oxygenated muscle fibers, right? Whereas things that we have to do once or twice, but very forcefully, so like throwing, jumping, moving heavy weights, things like this, those are done with our more, fast twitch, quicker fatiguing, but way more force producing muscles, like our glutes, our quads, our pecs. And for those of you whom this discussion has raised more questions, such as how does one determine their fiber type distribution? Well, the only way to know for sure is to get a biopsy. I've had several of these done over the years. Back in the day, they used to be real painful. They had to actually take like a big old chunk out of your muscle. Nowadays, it's practically like a insulin syringe. It's almost nothing. But that notwithstanding, your fiber type distribution has a lot to do with, of course, like everything else, genetics, right? But also training history. You can adjust your fiber types depending on how you train. This discussion, however, is more in service to taking your knowledge now of the Henneman size principle and applying it to your training to get the most out of specific circumstances for better muscle growth. So let's go back to the beginning where we talked about progressive overload. With our understanding of the Henneman size principle, adding more weight to the bar triggers muscle growth because as the weight gets heavier, you can't use your smaller, slower twitch, less fatiguing muscles. You have to engage the larger ones, the more fatiguing ones, the heavier the weight becomes. And this makes sense from a simple physics engineering perspective, right? More cross-sectional area just leverages that particular section of the muscle to exert more force on whatever object you're trying to move. And this is why those type 2 fibers are more prone to hypertrophy than the type 1 fibers are. The type 1 fiber is also hypertrophy, just not to the same extent because the lion's share of your mitochondria are in there. And so if the type 1's got too big, then per unit volume of creature, you would have a lower mitochondrial density, which nature seems to think is an unfavorable adaptation, and so it doesn't work that way. Okay, so obviously weight engages these larger fibers. We know why. But the other way that they are engaged is under fatigue. And so this is how volume works as well. After a while, the biggest, strongest ones get smoked. So the ones just under that got to pick up the slack, and so on and so on and so on. The longer you strain or the more work you try to do, whatever fibers that still got gas left in them are going to have to engage as well to help you complete that lift. The longer the set becomes, the more volume you accrue, the more fibers are activated, and consequently, the more progressive tension overload. At the end of the day, it's all about engaging the most amount of fibers however you do that. If you're fresh and healthy, then load is probably your quickest, most efficacious means of doing so. If you're fatigued, if injury is a concern, if you're new to the movement, then you can get there with volume. Or for that matter, training in a stretch position, where now you're mechanically, from a physics perspective, disadvantaged, and so in accordance with the size principle, you will have to engage the larger fibers to move lighter loads on account of that particular force curve, making a lighter weight relatively heavier based on your position. Information is ammunition, folks. You can just go to the gym and toss weights around and still make progress, but you can make progress a lot faster if you understand fundamentally, mechanistically, how the thing that you're doing actually works. If you enjoy the content I'm putting out, like, subscribe, and share to help the channel grow. And comment down below any topics you'd like me to make content on in the future. Consistency is a superpower. Stay in the fight. Thanks for watching.